Hello, welcome to the Spanish Pavilion, where we will having an event called Building Back to Adapt and Transform. The central idea of this event is that we are now seeing a big change in terms of extreme events becoming much more extreme. We know now that climate change impacts are here, and therefore these events will become more frequent and more intense. So one of the things that in the tradition of from the Sendai Convention, on disasters, is that they have a lot of experience on the concept of building back better. And we think the time has come for two communities that have a lot of experience, the community of disasters and the community of climate change adaptation, to shake hands, because now disasters and climate change adaptation are in fact two sides of the same coin. So the experience of disasters on managing these extreme events, which is extremely valuable, but at the same time, when we have these extreme events that we've seen in countries like Brazil and in my own country, where we had a very traumatic and extreme event, which we only commemorated a few weeks ago, a year, that I would actually say had a huge impact on my country and on civil society also in Spain, is a time that we can shake hands and learn, so that when we have, in a way, this funding coming to reconstruct, we have to take into consideration that the climate has changed, and therefore we have to build to adapt to the long-term changes. We know that there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know what scenario will materialize. Hopefully, the COP will increasingly be successful, because the best adaptation is in fact mitigation. But we know that even if we succeeded with the most ambitious goals, which hopefully we will, even then we will have to adapt, because the impacts are already here. So with that, I'm going to very briefly present the panel that we have. And we want to basically merge the experience at what's going on in the global level. So that's why we're at COP. But we also want to hear firsthand from cities that have experienced these events. At the end of the day, most people will live in cities, so it's a very, very important entry point. Of course, we understand that we have to also manage, on a territorial scale. For example, in Spain, in the event that we had an inland tsunami, partly because of very poor management of the, upstream, in terms of, agricultural land use. So we know we need to have this holistic approach, but cities are actually a very, very good place to start to operate from. So with that, I'm going to very briefly present, just very briefly, the people that we have in the panel, so you know who they are. And then we're going to have a keynote speech, from Animesh Kumar. So first, we have Caterina Corrali. She's the executive secretary. No, sorry. We have Caterina Sarafati, managing director of the C40 Group. Welcome to our panel. We also have Carmen Marquez. She's an EU Climate Pact ambassador. And in a previous life, she used to be an EU diplomat working on environmental law. And so very used to kind of multilateral agreements, but most important, she's from Valencia. So she will speak today as a citizen, which is a very, very important role that we often forget. What citizens have to say about these events. And then we also have Rodrigo. He's actually the representative of ICLEI in Latin America and also in Brazil, the head of ICLEI in Brazil. But also, very important, he comes from Porto Alegre, which again is another city that experienced very, very traumatic floods only recently. So the idea is that we will have this very global, local discussion, because at the end of the day, all these discussions in these big events that were happening have to land on the ground with people that live in these cities that are experiencing these very dramatic changes. So with that, I'm going to now pass the floor to Animesh Kumar. He's the head of UNCDR in Bonn, and he's going to basically give us some very insights onto what he's seen at the moment in changes globally, but particularly speaking with his head of disasters, having a dialogue with climate change adaptation. Welcome to the podium.
Thank you very much, Helena. I'm not sure whether my sound is okay. It's okay? Manageable. Thanks a lot, everyone. A very good morning to the second day of the second week of the COP30. I would try to give an overview of Sendai framework, why is it important for the work we are doing, and how is it connecting with the work that in particular this COP is doing, but in more extending it to this specific topic on recovery and building back better. The Sendai framework was among the 3 international frameworks that were adopted in 2015, 10 years ago. So in March, Sendai framework, then SDGs in mid of the year, and then Paris Agreement end of the year. The focus of the Sendai framework is to ensure that we not only recover well from a disaster, but also prevent future disasters. And that is possible only when we ensure that people have the right levels of resilience, capacity, and the ability to manage the hazards in a much more strong way. Now, coming to recovery, it's very important that we understand the importance of planning for recovery. Often countries have plans for responding to disasters, but then start developing a recovery plan after the disaster has happened. And this is very normal because countries and all of us tend to follow a disaster risk management cycle, which we are questioning now these days, starting from prevention of disasters, preparing for disasters, responding to disasters, recovering from it, reconstruction, rehabilitation, and then goes back to prevention. But now we are questioning this because if we start this following this cycle, the planning for recovery often will start after the disaster impacts have already taken place, we have responded to it, and then we start planning for recovery. In most cases, this becomes too late in terms of planning for the recovery. Because if we are late in planning for recovery, we are not giving enough time for the communities to recover and become resilient for the future disasters. A delayed recovery from disasters, as a result of which actually accentuates and pronounces the impact of disasters further and erodes the resilience level of communities over time. Hence, we have come out with a recovery readiness framework. It was just passed through an inter-consultation process, and it is in the public domain. I'll be happy to share that with you as well. And the recovery readiness framework focuses on how to have pre-disaster recovery planning so that the communities and countries can come out of disasters in a much more resilient way than if we delay that process. Now, there are some key elements of this recovery process. One of the key elements is that the infrastructure part of recovery is something which is very important. Where do people live after the disaster has happened in the recovery stage? Do we have the right elements in place to recover and ensuring that right kind of infrastructure, the physical infrastructure is there? The second part is more in terms of ensuring that livelihoods are secured. So people lose their infrastructure, but then they get back to business with enough time. And this highlights the role of safety net programs. Do we have the right social protection mechanisms so that even though people lose their assets, their livelihoods are secured? This becomes very important in the context of some specific disasters. For example, droughts. We have seen in many parts of Africa, where I was working for 10 years before moving to Bangkok and then to Bonn, that we often call it that there is a hydrometeorological hazard called drought, but it can stay as a hydrometeorological hazard without affecting the livelihoods of people if we have the right social protection mechanisms in place. So even though the hazard takes place, people do not get affected. And people do not get affected, it means disaster did not happen. So it remained as a hazard. So livelihood protection is very important. And the third and final important thing which we all of us often miss out in recovery stage is the social aspect of it. This is very important in the context of urban areas, in particular the cities, because social capital is not very high in urban areas as much as in the rural areas. And there is sociologically, it has been proven that if you have direct access to resources, the incentive to collaborate is less, and hence social capital is less in the urban areas. But disasters are also a reminder that if we don't work together, we will have soon another disaster in the future. So in the recovery stage, the emotional aspect of people, that they have seen something with their own eyes, can that be used to prevent future disasters? And this aspect is often forgotten because people have a cognitive bias. The cognitive bias is, I will respond to what I see. I will never respond to what I don't see. Why do I need to prepare for something which I don't know will happen or not happen? But if there has a disaster which has just happened, the recovery stage can be used as a very important timeline. It's a very sweet spot around that time when people are fresh. They have seen a disaster, they know what the impact is. Can we use that social aspect of disasters at that time to prevent future disasters from happening? That's all about recovery. But we are also being challenged in our own potential for recovery because of the increasing impact of disasters because of climate change. We have seen that the cumulative impact of high frequency, low impact events is often exceeding a single catastrophic event. If that be the case, imagine a situation where the frequency of events is increasing, more and more disasters are happening very quickly, very frequently. By the time you respond and recover, another event is happening, and then by the time you respond and recover, another event has happened. So there is a continuous cycle of prevent, respond, recover, which is a very vicious circle. To break this cycle, the only way we can do it is to gear up and prevent. If we can prevent the events better, we don't have to get into the cycle of recovering and responding and then so on and so forth. It's very important that prevention is seen not as an add-on to development. Let me give you an example. In the context of infrastructure, it has been calculated that the additional cost of integrating resilience into infrastructure projects is 3%. But the returns to that investment is $4 or €4 for every €1 spent during the project cycle of that infrastructure. The bottom line, the footnote to this understanding is also that you cannot make this as an add-on to development. So you cannot build a house and then make it resilient. You have to integrate resilience into the very foundation of that infrastructure. If you don't do that, retrofitting and risk transfer and insurance becomes very expensive. I work in the industry, in the business of risk management. And often we say that risk management is a thankless job. It's a thankless job because the best thing that will happen is that nothing will happen. And if you don't do your work well, disasters will happen and then people will criticize you. So it's a lose-lose situation for us. If we do everything well, disasters don't happen and the governments may tell us, you made us invest so much of money, but nothing happened. Like, yeah, precisely that's the point, nothing should happen. But how do you prove that? Through your actions, nothing happened. We are working very strongly on this to create the right evidence base so that we can show that prevention pays off. I just give one example that every $1 in infrastructure resilience gives back $4 in investment. We also have evidence now that the global mortality because of disasters has declined by half. So half the number of people are dying today than they used to die 2 decades back. That's a current success. We also have anecdotal evidence, like in Bangladesh, cyclone, 1999, a cyclone struck, more than 10,000 people died. 2019, 20 years later, a cyclone of the same intensity struck and less than 50 people died. It goes on to show that if we do prevention well, it actually pays off. But to do so, we need a few key enablers, and I'll count 3 of them. The first one is to know our risk. Do we have the right data? Do we have the right risk knowledge to take the right action? Because if we do not have the right data, we cannot inform our own actions. We need to understand how much we have lost in the past, how much we are losing now, and how much we may lose in the future. This requires us to invest into the right data ecosystem. From our side, we have been capacitating countries. More than 100 countries have developed disaster loss databases, and this goes down to the lowest administrative unit in many of these countries to collect this data in a very meaningful way. When we have this data, people can take more meaningful decisions. How much of risk to prevent, how much of risk to avoid, and how much of risk to transfer. And this part is very important because if we don't have this kind of an information, we will not be able to take the right decision. Let us take the example of real estate, housing industry. In any area, imagine a situation where we do not know if this area is located in an earthquake-prone area, or what is the frequency of floods that will strike this area. It is not in the interest of the construction agencies to provide that information to you, because that reduces the cost of the property. And if, as the buyer, we don't get that information, we will go and accept that risk. We buy that risk by buying that property. Now what happens is that if the infrastructure, the house, has not been well constructed, you will soon have to pay a lot of money for retrofitting on the one side and insurance on the other. The more risk we transfer because we have not invested well in prevention, higher will be the cost of insurance. Higher is the cost of insurance, lower will be the buyers, and then again this continues as a cycle. The best way to get out of this cycle, invest in prevention and take a meaningful decision. So for example, if we are buying a house and we know that this area is prone to earthquake up to 5 on the Richter scale, 6 may or may not happen, 7 is not possible in this area. We know that information. And if we also have the information that the return period of floods is 20 years and high intensity floods may happen every 50 years. With all that information, one may decide that let me construct my house which can easily withstand an earthquake of 5. With some more 3% investment can go up to 6. 7 is not a possibility, but if it is possible, I will buy the insurance for that. And hence my cost of insurance is low. So that is what data does. If we have the right risk knowledge, we take the right decision. The second element is governance, the right regulatory measures, the right policy regime. There are 137 countries in the world that have a disaster risk reduction plans. There are 67 countries in the world that have a national adaptation plan. There are 48 countries that have both. And we need to ensure that when we implement risk management, whether through DRR plan or adaptation plan, it is done in a coherent way. So no matter whether we implement disaster risk reduction or adaptation, it is done in a very coherent way so that there is no duplication of implementation. Just to give you an example, early warning system is the 7th target of Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. It is the 8th target of the Global Goal Adaptation being negotiated here. It is also part of Article 8 of the Paris Agreement on Loss and Damage. But it is the same early warning system for the same community, but 2 different ministries are looking for resources for the same activity in the same country, in the same community. And we don't have enough resources. So we talk about less resources, but we are fragmenting. I think it's very important that we strengthen our policy ecosystem and do it in a way so that we minimize duplication. But the most important part is my third and final point is community engagement. If we do not engage the communities in decision-making process, they will not take action when the disasters strike. It also leads to the point that if they depend too much on the government, it creates a false sense of security because the governments may or may not be able to do everything. Risk management is everyone's business, and we can make it work only if everybody decides, and everybody can decide and take a common decision only when they have been involved in the decision-making process. So with that, I'll conclude and I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Animesh. So now we're moving on to the discussion and the debate to hear from our excellent panel. We welcome our last speaker, Annalisa Corrado. She's a member of the European Parliament, part of the ENVI group, so very much welcome. And it also brings that we have this multi-level governance here, so we have the global level, of course with Animesh and Caterina from C40, but we also have the European scale. Brazil, as a host country, and then Valencia, my home country with Carmen. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go directly from the global to the local, because I think it's very, very important to keep this connection, with what actually happens, that these disasters, they're not theoretical, while we were at COP yesterday, we actually experienced what is a tropical storm. Then we have local flood, and these events are here to stay with us. So I'm going to actually start with our host country, because we've been really enjoying staying in Belém, at the heart of the Amazon. So Rodrigo, one question. In terms of civil society, one of the things that is very, very important is the role of civil society in these events. What is your experience from the events in Porto Alegre in 2024? Tell us, how you think these disasters, are kind of experienced firsthand, and maybe some lessons learned from what happened in Porto Alegre, based on what Animesh was commenting on.
Thank you, Elena. Do you hear me? Do you hear me? Okay. No? Now, I believe now you do. Thank you so much. Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you. Hello, guys. Hello, hello. Do you hear me? Is that okay? I can. They hear me? Okay, great. Is that okay, guys? Okay, thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to thank to the Spain Pavilion, to the Spanish Pavilion. Thank you so much for the possibility of hosting this event. Thank you so much, Elena, to support in that matter. Hello, hello. Is that okay? I think so. Closer? Okay. Now? Done. Thank you, guys. First of all, I'd like to thank Elena for the invitation. Thank you for the catalyst to welcome myself. I believe that I'm here in my capacity, of course. I'm going to always talk through and by my organization. My name is Rodrigo Corradi. I'm the director for ICLEI in Brazil, the deputy executive secretary for ICLEI in South America. It's a pleasure to be here with all my colleagues, panelists that are sharing this stage with me. And in this, I promise I'm gonna go to the question, Elena, but I just wanted to emphasize that I believe that I was also invited because I'm from the city of Porto Alegre in the south of Brazil, capital city of the state of Rio Grande do Sul. It was a city that in 2024 had a major flood in the state of Rio Grande do Sul that was considered the worst flood occurred in Brazil in this past 75 years. We have a total of, in 7 days, a total of plus 1,200 millimeters that was poured in the state of Rio Grande do Sul. This was done in 2 days super fast. And in that moment, we had regions that we had Valencia similar situations in terms of how fast the flood was and how this completely destroyed whole range of cities. We have 7 cities that were completely destroyed. And at that specific moment, the city of Porto Alegre, that lies in front of a lake, the Lake Guaíba. For those that had the opportunity, Porto Alegre is well known by the World Social Forum. For those of you that in this past decades have been in Porto Alegre, the city has a major lake. This major lake actually holds basically 200 rivers that come from the north of the state. Those rivers, they were poor of water. They came strongly, and they made that the city was for 2 months with 30% of its area flooded. So it's a city of 1 million, 1.5 million inhabitants in a metropolitan area that was as strongly heated of 4.5 million inhabitants, the metropolitan area of Porto Alegre. The state of Rio Grande do Sul has 11 million inhabitants. Of those, 75% were directly impacted. So for the state of Rio Grande do Sul, it was not only a major climate event, it was completely a completely situation of how can we rebuild any state. And in that sense, I'm going for the questioning. What I can tell you, and it was amazing that Animesh was able to showcase to us the whole reference that we have, not only from UNDRRR, but from the global community as a whole, as how we should be prepared for events like this, and how we should rebuild from events like this, and how we are having the big problem is that we do not have the timing to do it so in the way that we were expecting. This flood, the reference of this flood, was one that was in reference for the state of Rio Grande do Sul in 1942. The problem was not this flood. The fact was, in this past 3 years, the state of Rio Grande do Sul every 6 months has had his biggest flood ever. So in 2 years' time, the state had faced in different capacities the biggest flood that we had ever had. In September 2023, we have in the same region a major flood that was bigger than the one 40 years ago in 1942. And people were thinking, and I remember because I was with the state of Rio Grande do Sul governor in, was the time, Dubai, and he was presenting, we need to support to rebuild. And less than 6 months later, he has an even much bigger flood that had ever been in the state. So I want to emphasize the timing. The specific zone of the southern part of Brazil, in the area that we face, the southern part of Brazil, north of Argentina and Uruguay is one of those specific blue dots that UNFCCC presents as a reference of areas that we're going to continue to have continued support of water, but in a fashion that it's so irregular the way in which this water we're going to hit the ground, that you're going to have this kind of situations continue on. We don't have the luxury to think that we're going to have to wait for 60 years for another flood like this. And I'm going to emphasize in this moment of this conversation that it would be impossible to think that the state of Rio Grande do Sul, and we are less than 2 years later on, if you go to Porto Alegre, you wouldn't recognize that the city had the pictures that you were able. If you text Porto Alegre flood, you're going to see pictures that are amazing. I have to go to my house that was in the street was 2 meters of water. I had to take a boat and take this boat through the major streets of my city. This is something that I will never forget. And it's almost as impossible to think that today it seems that nothing happened. And this is a little bit troublesome because it mixed a little bit with our sense of urgency. But I want to emphasize the sense in which it could be impossible to recover and to support this faction is the fact that this was not a situation of an earthquake that in 48 hours you're going to pass by. We have this flood situation for 2 months. And so it will be impossible to not think that it's possible to bear that if civil society couldn't bring together. We have volunteers for all over Brazil. So it was a way in which the country held it together throughout the action in my city and my state as a whole. We have support of volunteers from all over the country. Support financially, the federal government was able to rearrange special efforts that still today are mandatory to recover the state as a whole. But the volunteers, they were key in this process. But I want to emphasize that something that I passed through, my experience, because before I was working in Eric Clay, I was 13 years civil servant from the city of Porto Alegre. And I know that we need to understand, and this is a bit of the provocation that I want to, is to try to understand ways in which we can attract, make the best of the support of volunteers, but in the same pace, think about how we're going to support the civil servants that we're going to continue on. When the situation was not in its peak, the volunteers came back home for other states, and as they should. But the fact is that you will continue to have public employees, public servants that was working 12 hours a day, 16 hours a day, not income for their house. Many of them, their houses were completely flooded as well. They didn't have their house to get back to. So we have to understand that in extreme climate events like this, and I believe that's the take that I want to primarily emphasize over here, is to try to balance the way in which you're going to be able to help each other and to have institutions that can sustain and can be resilient in that matter of facts. So in the city like Porto Alegre that has around 1,500 public employees, 75% of those employees were directly deployed for relief and immediate recovery actions. Those people, they have post-traumatic stress completely in their veins right now. I know plenty of them. They are friends of mine. They are like family for me. So to understand that we're going to have to sustain this, and a little bit of my hat of local government as ICLEI, I come back to use it right now, that we're going to need to understand the way in which we're going to have to face that local governments will be the ones that will have to continue this. Special deployment from national government, the volunteers from outside the territory, they're going to go and they're going to come. But the public servants especially, and the community that is going to be in those extreme weather events areas, they're going to sustain this. This is not just a place that you're going to support with their bigger heart, and it's fantastic that the people could do this, but this is their home. This is the place that they call it home, where they have their kids, and to reshape the idea of security that you have when you have a home, isn't it? When you have a home, the basic elements is that you have the security to have a roof over your shoulders. When you have events like this, you collectively think, okay, this roof that I have over my shoulders it's not as secure as I used to see. And we need to emphasize the way in which we can have public-private process that could endure and support the civil capacity to engage, but also the public need to be supportive not only to the actions that must be done, but towards the people that we're going to support in that way. Thank you, Lina.
Thank you very much. So I think what we're going to do now probably will be more like one presentation from each person. I think we won't. I think that's fine, because I think I would rather about the role of civil.
I am going to speak now as a European Climate Pact ambassador from Valencia, and so I will try to bring you the sensitivity of a citizen. After having heard the experience of Porto Alegre, it is true that some of the feelings, some of the problems that you mentioned also appear in what happened in Valencia. There was, as you may know, we had a huge flood on the 29th of October of last year, and these were floods that had a dimension that exceeded previous experiences. We had a big flood in Valencia in 1957, and we always have in October La Gota Fria, but we had never had this kind of experience. And even this flood of mud happened in places that didn't receive any, even a drop of rain that day. So we had 229 dead people. We had 72 municipalities that were affected. We had a lack of water and a blackout that lasted for several days, that increased the feeling of vulnerability of many people. We had also many people who lost everything, their houses, their belongings, their memories, their livelihoods. We had 150,000 vehicles destroyed. You may have seen the pictures where you had several cars piled up that were blocking streets and roads. We had also shops, companies, shopping malls, industrial parks that were flooded, because you have to understand that one of the areas that was most seriously affected was Horta Sur, that is the southern metropolitan area of Valencia, where many people live, but they go to work in Valencia, but they cannot afford the cost of living in Valencia city. So and also in that area you have a very strong presence of Valencian enterprises. You have industrial parks. We also had huge agricultural damages. We had bridges and roads collapsing, that were collapsed. And we also had lots of misinformation. So you have also to understand that in these moments where information is precious, we also received misinformation that was trying to increase this feeling of vulnerability and loss in the population. But also we had tons of mud, but also we had tons of solidarity. And this was something that really warmed the hearts of many people. Personally, I was not directly affected by the flood because I live in the city of Valencia, and we had a deviation of the river many years ago. We had an investment in infrastructure that saved the city, as I said, but then that implied also that the southern part of the metropolitan area was very seriously affected. But so we had, then this also allowed many people in Valencia, but also in the rest of Spain, in other countries, to show up. It was really very, very impressive to see how many people, and in particular young people, youth, who took their brooms, took their bottles of water, took the food that they collected from relatives and from friends, and they walked. So they walked the talk. So they walked through a wonderful bridge that is called now the Bridge of Solidarity. And they went there just with their hands to show empathy, to show readiness to help, and to show that they really cared about their other citizens of these areas. And I have also to say that the community response in Valencia was very strong. We have what we call Las Fallas, that I don't know whether people from outside Valencia or outside Spain know. It is an association of citizens who prepare the whole year for the feast called the Las Fallas. And so many people in Valencia are members of these associations called Las Fallas, and there was a lot of solidarity that was channeled through that. For example, we organized, the ambassadors of the European Climate Pact, we organized a meeting on the 21st of March where Enrique was there and Elena was there and other people who, scientists, ambassadors, citizens, mayors of that area. And it was just the 21st of March, and we did a climate walk in El Barranco del Pollo, and we could see a falla, so a structure that had been built with the solidarity and the money collected by other fallas, just to show this empathy, to show that people cared about what was happening to other people that had been less lucky than they were. So indeed, the role of communities is extremely important, and I have to say that we have an amazing ambassador in Horta Sur, Julio Huerta, who is the director of Fundación Horta Sur, who has, this organization collected funds. They organized a kind of crowdfunding. People were ready to help, but of course they were afraid that they would give money to organizations that were not reliable. But this organization, during more than 50 years, had shown that they were serious, that they cared about the region, and also they had been supporting community life. So you should be aware that there is now an ongoing call for justice in Valencia. And this is something that has to be taken into account. That you cannot think of recovery just in terms of infrastructure or funds. Of course, this is very important. But there is also another dimension that is the social dimension, the institutional and political dimension, and also the individual, the mental health dimension. But so, for example, in the case of Valencia, my impression is that until we don't resolve the issue of identifying responsibilities and the issue of solving the climate justice claims that are being presented, we will not be able to recover. So the feeling that the warning came too late is too strong to bear the burden. If you talk to the associations of the victims, and we also had another very important meeting organized by another ambassador, Juan Medina, who used to be a climate city councillor in Quart de Poblet. And these people lost their relatives just because they didn't get the warning at the time where they could have taken this information into account, and they would have abstained from taking the car, or they would have gone to just a floor upper up. So in fact, many people who died were old people who were vulnerable people, and also with very, very humble economic needs. As it has been said, of course, it's important to think of building back better, not just repeating the mistakes of the past. And now let me go to lessons learned, because I think that we have some important lessons to be taken into account, because it is clear that we are going to have similar experiences, as you have said. So it's a matter of time. Now it's clear that we have reached this kind of limit of the 1.5 degrees centigrade, and especially in the Mediterranean region, it means more floods and more wildfires. So the first lesson is that we are very vulnerable. We think that we are living in developed societies, but in fact, climate change is now affecting everybody. Until recently, we thought that climate disasters were something that happened in the Pacific Island or in the Caribbean, but now it happens, and the Mediterranean is really a very dangerous place for that. So the Mediterranean is a climate hotspot. We are seeing that. Then also we learned that it's essential to have early warning, and that's something that I think is a lesson that our politicians have learned. Now in Valencia and in other regions of Spain, if you have a serious warning of rain, you have the red alert, the orange alert. So this has in any case been understood. We also need to improve preparedness at community level, and also to improve citizen education. As it has been said, local governments and local and mayors, they have the immediate responsibility, especially mayors. Municipalities, they are the ones that are in the front line in case there is a serious flood or a serious threat happening concerning climate change, and they have to be given the resources. I agree with you. We need to support the officials working in these municipalities. We have to give, to train them. We have to support them, and also we have to give them some funds, because very often you have the mayor who is just the person to whom all the claims are being addressed, but they don't have the resources to give a proper reply. Also, we need to improve the link between science and policy. Yesterday we heard about the efforts on science in the Mediterranean, and how this link between science and policy is not always so fluent in the Mediterranean area. And I think that the Valencia Dana showed that if science had been taken into account, something, the impact would have been much lighter, much lower. Also, we need to adapt our civil protection to climate emergencies in the Mediterranean. So we have to improve our civil protection, taking into account our context, so that we have, we are more prone to floods and to wildfires. So if we have to do some training, we have to do that. We have to take into account that we are in a Mediterranean context where you don't have a river, and then suddenly water comes. It happened in Utiel, where I regularly go in the holidays to Sinarcas, a small village near Utiel. And when the flood was starting, a friend of mine sent me the video and told me, Carmen, El Río Magro has flooded Utiel. And then we said, El Río Magro, what river? Because in fact, in the Mediterranean, you don't see big rivers on a usual basis. No? Then also we have to improve the coordination of our institutions. You know, we have a political system in Spain that is based on the distribution of competences between the national government, the regional governments, and you know, this didn't work properly. So we have to have a clear assignment of responsibilities, and in a way that it is automatic, so that in these kind of emergencies you need to have some, you know, a clear structure of decision. And then, you know, prevention is more effective and less costly than reconstruction, as has been said. The importance of trust and empathy. We need to strengthen the coordination of public institutions, and this is something that we have not yet solved. You know, in Spain now we have a climate of political confrontation that if we have again a climate emergency will not allow us to respond properly. And then we have also to recognize, this was a lesson learned, that the civil society had a huge role, and in particular, youth. They are not only victims, they are actors.
Thank you very much, Carmen. So now we're going to go back to, you know, to the global level. So we actually have the pleasure of having with us Katerina from C40. And I just wanted you to kind of continue more on this kind of what next, you know, and your experience from C40 about, you must be seeing this trend. You really, you know, looking at the biggest cities in the world in all kinds of climates, but everyone, there is this pattern. So what is your experience on building back? And I would actually argue the point we're making today, to adapt. You know, it's no longer build back better, it's actually considering also climate change.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. Thanks for having the perspective of C40. And a lot has been said already by my fellow colleagues, so I will try to be brief. I think I will start by saying, given we are in the middle of the negotiations and it's a intense day today, there's the global adaptation goal is being discussed in these rooms. It also is what is being discussed is this COP to be the COP of implementation and moving from negotiation to implementation, which is a call of the COP presidency that we strongly support. But none of the two, the delivery of a global goal on adaptation and the delivery of a COP of implementation, will be possible without subnationals and without cities at the heart of the negotiation space. And this is what our main concern today, having seen the draft text come out, is that the role of cities and subnationals in adapting, in increasing resilience, in protecting communities, in moving forward on implementation is still not completely recognized in the work of the negotiators at date. And you know, coming from Rio de Janeiro in the past days, this is particularly concerning because we had 14,000 representatives of local communities, states, regions, governors, cities coming in Rio de Janeiro just before COP with a clear action agenda, action position, basically stating for the first time, and this is like a very new statement in the political arena, stating for the first time that they were willing not to talk anymore about distant targets to 2030 to 2050, both on adaptation and mitigation and just transition, but they were willing to say what they're going to do to reduce emissions and increase the resilience of communities every 12 months. So that every year there is annual accountability on what cities and local governments are doing on the fronts of the topics of the negotiations. And the implicit message is, if cities and local governments with a lack of resources, with a lack of recognition, with all the challenges that they're seeing, being at the front line of climate action, at the front line of climate change, at the front line of disinformation, can do it, then everybody else can do it. But we need that recognition to happen at this level. And this is particularly visible and I think acute when it comes to talking about flooding, the reaction to flooding, increasing resilience of communities. We are seeing it very, very clearly in cities, not just in terms of the exposure. Our research shows that by 2050, for example, riverine flooding alone will expose 7.4 million people and inflict $64 billion damage annually. It's basically the economies of big cities, of big countries. But also in terms of the positive side, everything that my colleagues have spoken about in terms of putting together systemic approaches that look at involving the communities, increasing resilience of people, starting for the most vulnerable, including disaster management in urban planning, putting together urbanization with reforestation, with resilience, with mitigation. All of this happens at local level, plays out at local level, and also has a very local touch to it, because increasing resilience in Valencia is very different from doing it in Freetown. So we see common trends, but there's also very much local specificities. And our cities are already doing it. They are really, really already doing it, from Accra piloting the first ever municipal social protection scheme for women workers and workers affected by heat and flooding, to Freetown for the first time having a joint public policy on loss and damage mitigation and adaptation by assessing the impacts on women workers in the trade market when heat arrives, and therefore what to do to better increase the resilience of women trade workers, to also global north cities from Los Angeles and Warsaw, increasing the resilience of frontline communities through mitigation and adaptation approaches. So this is really already happening, but all of this cannot stay out of the process of the most important political global governing body of climate as the UN COP process. So what we are asking as cities, all of the local government communities, is we're asking that for the first time there is a formal space recognized as part of the negotiated outcomes, a multi-level dialogue between cities, subnationals and national governments to accelerate implementation, to fill the ambition gap, to accelerate our common climate goals, and that this is mandated by the UNFCCC or the COP presidency as part of the negotiated outcomes. It would be a first time. There is momentum, there is support. We really need parties and the presidents to push forward and include this, because this is not a constituency asking for a seat at the table. It's a constituency asking for the table to be different, to be more focused on implementation, to be more focused on action, to be more focused on people, to be more focused on the needs of the communities at the margin, because this is what is happening at local level, and we need this to be recognized at the global one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was great. Thank you. So I think now we have a last speaker, Annalisa. Now, and I wanted to kind of put it all in the context. At the moment, the EU, is undergoing a lot of. I think as a climate pact ambassador, we're both here. Concern, from citizens' perspective, about, keeping the direction, the ambition, and particularly now we're seeing the impacts, as we're discussing, the climate change is not in the future, we even have youth before saying we know the future generations, we're the current generations, So I think this is very important. And at the moment in the EU, it's important because next year we will have the EU Climate Adaptation Plan, and also the discussion, which is linked to what Animesh was saying earlier about resilience by design, this idea that we can kind of think differently about how we incorporate this. So from that perspective, as a politician, what is your thoughts about how we can actually ensure that the voices of citizens, are taken up by decision makers, and somehow, we keep this ambition, particularly now, with the current geopolitical context, which is putting a lot of tension on keeping the ambition and the implementation. And I would also ask to what was saying by Caterina, the inclusion also of municipalities, actually, that local level.
Thank you very much. I speak without the earphone because okay. No, I think it is a very crucial question, very difficult to answer because the question is very big. And first of all, I would say that also in Italy we are experimenting a lot situation of drought and floods. Sometimes we have our country that is very long inside the Mediterranean Sea that is completely divided in two. One part in the south is completely in the middle of droughts, and the north part is in floods. At the same day, in this summer, we lost two people, two workers for for temperatures too hot, and something like 300 kilometers on the other side, we lost other people for a flood, exactly in the same day. So climate change is real, and some of our countries is experimenting it in a very heavy way. No? So, but it is really worrying that in this period in Europe, the popularity of Green Deal is at the lowest point, and the politician balance is changed a lot. And so even if in the European Parliament, the majority voted for a commission that committed itself to go ahead with the Green Deal politics and with the ambition of climate justice and more with a more strong commitment to the social part of the policies. Now we are facing some difficulties, and we cannot say that is different. No, we have, fortunately, we have in the good path the climate law. We have ambitious target for 2040, but I think it's quite a miracle in this situation now at the European level. So it's a good point for us because we are here with the good and ambition NDCs, but it's a fight. It's a continuous fight to keep the ambition. And it's very worrying because our countries are facing a lot of problems, that we are in the middle of also a cultural problem, because mitigation now it's under attack because there are a lot of interests in the fossil fuels world, and so we are facing a lot of problems for building plants, for example, to put political burden to enterprises. We saw with the Omnibus one. No? So we are facing a lot of problem with mitigation, and it's incredible because the technologies of mitigation are economically are a win-win situation, because they don't need 80% more or less of these technologies don't need funding to be built, no? And but there are a lot of burdens to be exploited, and so this is a great problem we face. And on the other hand, the adaptation is a word that is very friendly to the society and also very transversal in all the political parts, but it is used like an excuse not to talk about mitigation. We are very aware that mitigation and adaptation are the same coin. One is one face and one another, that it's impossible to adapt if we don't mitigate. No, it's really impossible. So we have to mitigate as far as the adaptation will work. And even if we are very aware of it, the problem is that the adaptation economical rules are not independent. They need public funds. And we perfectly know that to invest €1 in preparation will let us 4 times or 5 times risparmi, savings, thank you, savings in the future, but is not an issue that we are able to put on the table in the investment at political level in our countries. So we are facing this kind of problem. And I think that adaptation plan in Europe will be built thinking about the instruments between which countries can build solid politics, rules, and instrument for citizens. Because if not, we will continue to talk about targets without instruments and without resources. And this is a huge problem also for the people to understand that change is possible and not only something that someone puts from the top to down. No? So I think we are in this kind of problems, and I think as politicians, our challenge is to change the sense of our fight, because we know that climate change has the same sources of social problems, of wars, of instability, of uncontrolled migration. So we have to change our perspective in order to give people the solution of the problem that they feel like everyday problem, building that solution, taking into consideration the climate change challenge. No? It's our challenge, I think, as politicians, because we perfectly know that as European, without decarbonization, we don't have any possibility to compete in this kind of world. Without decarbonization, we have any possibility to be autonomous and safer, and we have no possibility to have a role in the global discussion, no? Also in the markets. So we know it, but it's very difficult to give to people this kind of perspective. And when I heard, we also in Italy faced it, that a lot of people want to help when something happens. We have to build a more awareness that is not just this kind of help, but we have to restore inspiration and ambition on climate politics, because we need it to face all the other problems. Thank you.
Okay, I'll take this off. Okay, so I think we oh. Yeah. Okay, so I'll just do the final kind of summary of what we heard today. Thank you very, very much for the panel. It was fantastic. I think the main thing I wanted to stress, the key messages that I take away, and we will try to prepare like a very short brief on some of the lessons that we heard. So basically we heard, from Animesh Kumar, the idea of this risk management, that we really have to integrate now disasters and all this experience and knowledge that we have to build it into the system so we can actually prepare, and all the huge advantages that we see and the numbers in terms of, the numbers actually going down, positive news. I think we also heard very, very important from Rodrigo, that we have to remember civil society, but also public servants. We often forget about them, and they're very much on the front line, and they have to be supported because they're the ones, it's their communities, and they are, first interest to really look out for them, and that's a very valuable message. I think we also heard from Carmen, the experience in Valencia, about how communities really mobilize, to help communities, but also this importance of really having clear roles and responsibilities, and the importance of acknowledgement, the grief and the processes, the things that could have been avoided, which is why I kind of bring this idea of the Build Back to Adapt message. At the same time, we heard, also from Caterina, that in this COP30, there's increasing demand also from basically cities asking to have a role at the table, because they are the ones that really are experiencing, the impacts firsthand. They're in the front line. And then, of course, at the end, we also heard from Annalisa how we should not forget that mitigation, again, we need to be ambitious. Otherwise, the impacts, we will not be able to adapt. So we need to be ambitious also of the mitigation. But at the same time, this idea of not forgetting people, the social aspects, I think as a politician, she's very aware that at the end of the day, people have to be behind them. So we have to ensure that citizens, communities, we kind of push our politicians to be ambitious. So then we build back to adapt, and we take, this terrible disasters, extreme events, as an opportunity to transform deeply all our systems. Thank you very much for attending.